Judge, the defense would call Dr. Michael Mayer.
Testimony will be able to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so be done?
Yes, I do. Please, right here.
Thank you, Judge. Sir, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You want to get organized for a second?
Well, I'll just put my records here. If I need my laptop, I have it also.
Okay. Can you state your name for the record, please, and also spell your last name?
Michael Scott Mayer, M-A-H-E-R-M-D.
Dr. Mayer, can you tell us exactly what your profession or occupation is?
Yes, I'm a physician and psychiatrist licensed to practice medicine in the state of Florida, and I have a general outpatient psychiatric practice and what's called a forensic or legal practice.
How long have you been licensed to practice in the state of Florida?
Let's see, 1980, so 34 years.
34 years. What does it take to be licensed? Is there some regulatory body that administers licenses, and what would one need to do to become licensed to practice in your profession?
In Florida, necessary education, which is certified or qualified medical school, receiving an MD or a DO, and at least 1 year of supervised practice, which qualifies as an internship, or the equivalent done in some other state. There's reciprocity and so on. But basically medical school and a year of internship.
Are there continuing education requirements as one goes forward in your profession, sir?
There are indeed every year.
What does that entail?
The minimum of 40 hours a year of certified continuing medical education. There are also recertification procedures in specialty areas that various doctors, including myself, are subject to.
And just to be clear, and you may have touched on this earlier, but Dr. Mayer, do you have an area of specialization, and if so, what is it?
Yes, my area of specialization is psychiatry, so I'm a medical doctor and my specialization is in psychiatry. I also have what's called a subspecialty area, and that's in forensic psychiatry. Forensic psychiatry simply means anything to do with the law.
And how long have you been engaged in this particular specialty?
I have been engaged in this specialty since I completed my residency in psychiatry in 1983, and I have also been engaged in the specialty of forensic psychiatry essentially since that time. It was a new specialty at that time, and I received my board certification in it subsequently in 1999.
And that's as a forensic psychiatrist?
That's correct.
1999?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Mayer, can you tell us a little bit about your educational background prior to becoming specialized in forensic psychiatry?
Sure. I graduated from New College in Sarasota, Florida with a degree in molecular biology. I did some research on muscle proteins there. I then attended the University of South Florida College of Medicine and did the regular MD program. I then did a year of medical internship at Tampa General and the VA hospital in Tampa, and was involved in the research and training program as a specialist in psychiatry. I served as the chief resident of that program, where I had responsibilities, administrative and teaching, for other psychiatrists, and then I began my private practice and was also appointed to the university as a part-time assistant professor in psychiatry.
Aside from what you've just mentioned, Dr. Mayer, have you received any other education or training in your particular field?
I received a great deal. Frankly, all of the continuing medical education would be under that heading, and that's hundreds of hours. I haven't done any other programs such as an additional residency or that sort of thing.
And sir, you mentioned that you're involved or have been involved in some form of teaching. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, until 2 years ago, I continued to serve on the faculty at the University of South Florida College of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Medicine, and I was involved in teaching psychiatry residents who are doctors who are studying psychiatry to be specialized as I am, and medical students who are in the MD program. So I was engaged in primarily teaching, not so much research, for about 30 years until approximately 2 years ago.
Dr. Mayer, have you written any papers or articles or books or anything of that nature?
I have a couple of publications, some from my undergraduate work, a chapter of a book that I did during my residency.
Okay. And I take it you currently practice in this area?
I do, in Tampa, Florida.
Okay. Sir, have you previously been qualified to give expert testimony in a judicial proceeding of any kind?
Yes, I have.
Can you give us some kind of idea of what type of courts you've testified in?
Sure. I've testified in civil and criminal courts in Florida as well as other states, civil and criminal courts in the federal system. Most recently, I have testified most frequently in dependency court and family court. Dependency and family courts are non-criminal courts that address issues of child abuse and child custody, child neglect issues, placement of children who are taken out of the family's home.
Sir, approximately how many times have you been called upon to testify in the capacities you've mentioned?
Certainly several hundred over the last 30 years.
And I take it you've been qualified as an expert in those hundreds of opportunities to testify?
Yes.
On behalf of whom have you testified?
I testified on the behalf of defense attorneys in civil and criminal matters, plaintiffs' attorneys in civil matters, the state of Florida, most recently predominantly in dependency matters, that is what I was talking about, dependency court with abused children. Judges, very frequently I'm testifying at the request of a judge in a criminal competency hearing. That probably covers it.
And specifically, do you have a number or an approximate number of how many times you've offered testimony as an expert here in Hillsborough County?
All I would say is at least several hundred.
And
I don't keep those kinds of statistics or numbers that I could look at.
And have you testified in other counties besides Hillsborough?
Yes, I have.
Any other states besides Florida?
Yes.
Okay. Judge, at this time I would pass the witness for purposes of qualifications question if the state is so inclined.
No questions, thank you.
Judge, in that case, I would move that Dr. Mayer be declared an expert in the field of forensic psychiatry for purposes of this proceeding. Dr. Mayer, oh, excuse me, I didn't hear exactly what you said.
Continue, sir.
Thank you, Judge. Dr. Mayer, have you had an opportunity to examine my client, Julie Schenecker, concerning the subject of her sanity at the time of the incident that's the subject of this trial?
Yes, I have.
Before I get to any point in your testimony where I ask you if you've been able to reach an opinion about that subject, I would ask you to tell us in general what exactly did you do in this case. And I guess I would start by saying, how many times have you met with Ms. Schenecker?
I met with her on 11 separate occasions, primarily during 2011, also once in 2012 and once in 2013.
I take it those were all in settings in which you conferred with Ms. Schenecker. Was there anybody else present during those meetings?
There essentially was no one else present. There were deputies in the vicinity and possibly present in the very beginning of the meeting, but the meetings were held privately in a solitary confinement cell or other similar environment in the county jail.
So you met with Ms. Schenecker, I think you said 11 times?
Yes.
For approximately how many hours, sir?
The meetings varied from about a half an hour to almost 3 hours. I would say probably a little more than 20 hours.
Dr. Mayer, is it unusual that you would spend as much time with someone as you have, in this case, with a person that's being evaluated, or is that pretty standard?
It's a little more than usual. This was a particularly difficult, tragic, and in some ways complicated case. It was not easy to reach conclusions or understand the fundamental and important issues in this case.
In terms of assisting you with reaching conclusions and understanding the nature of the case, did you have any documents or evidence or things that you had a chance that were provided for you that you had a chance to look at?
I had many documents and other information that I relied on in evaluating and reaching conclusions in this case.
Let me ask you in general, without specifically addressing any of them at this moment, to tell me approximately how many different types of things you relied on and just identify those things that you generally relied on in this case.
Sure. Well, I would say to put the big picture on it, certainly medical records, and those medical records extended from some at least 10 years ago to the present. Law enforcement records, arrest records, interviews of police officers, pictures of the crime scene, things like that, other evidence that was gathered in the investigation. Personal communications, which may have been a part of the evidence or may have been independent of that, some emails, that sort of thing. Some family history, and I met with her parents and her brother also personally and interviewed them. I reviewed very briefly some other records, for example, military discharge record. I also reviewed many depositions of various individuals, police officers, as well as other experts who have been involved in this case at various different times. As a general description, those are the kinds of records and information that I relied on.
Dr. Mayer, if I can ask you to go back and tell us a little bit about those records. Let me ask you this. Let's start with a mention of medical records. You mentioned that those were the types of things you relied on, or among the things you relied on. Why medical records? What do they do to help you in reaching conclusions about someone?
Well, first of all, let me say that the medical records included a significant period of time well before this event. It included the medical records which were associated specifically with this event. Oh, and that reminds me of, among what I would consider the medical records, if you will, are some interviews, one of which was conducted while she was in the hospital immediately after she was arrested. Technically speaking, it wasn't a medical record, but it was done while she was in a hospital bed there. So the medical records include a period of time before the incident, period of time right around the incident, and subsequent to it. And in any medical evaluation, understanding the history and being able to evaluate the history based on medical records, which are in some ways more informative and more accurate than the history the patient describes. In some ways, they're not as informative or as accurate. But in this case, in a forensic case, in a legal case, where there are legal issues, and one has to be careful to check facts, the medical records, particularly the records before the incident, whatever it might be, are especially important because it allows an opportunity to determine what other professionals have thought about this person's medical and mental health status, and it provides an opportunity to review those without any concern, any serious concern that the person may have been faking or misrepresenting themselves because of this kind of case. So those medical records are important in all of those ways. Subsequent medical records are important to evaluate how the person's medical condition might be affected by the incident which has occurred, and how the course of their illness might change from years before to years after the incident in question.
So the more remote records would be valuable just as the more recent records would be?
Yes, that's correct.
You mentioned that you also review police reports, for example, the records that police officers keep. Why would you do that? How does that assist you?
Well, again, this is a source of information which tends to be somewhat limited, but very accurate. The police officers are good at putting in their records specific, detailed information. So dates, times, people who are present, things like that. Sometimes their interviews are audio recorded, as was the case here, and I reviewed the audio tape and transcript of some of the police interviews. So there's good, solid, reliable information there that it's essentially impossible to get from any other source.
Would you consider a police report to be a substitute for a mental health interview? For example, if you had a police interview and a mental health interview, would you consider those to be equal in terms of the value to you in analysis?
I might consider them to be equal in terms of value, but very different. Equal in the sense that an apple and an orange can be equal in value, but they're very different.
Can you explain a little bit about the difference between the two of them?
Sure. Police officers appropriately are looking for, trying to get at, and trying to understand a situation from a particular perspective. And they're often faced in a situation where they have very little information, where in the course of the evaluation they're still examining or evaluating issues of immediate dangerousness. So a police officer has a very different point of view and very different job, very different duty, very different burden than a mental health person. A mental health person is charged, if you will, has the duty to try to understand human beings functioning, their thought processes on a very different, deeper, if you will, level than a police officer. So they are very different kinds of interviews, very different kinds of interactions, both very valuable in understanding not just behavior, but also motivation about what has happened and why.
Dr. Mayer, another set of records that you indicated that you looked at would be the records or reports from other mental health professionals, such as yourself. Can you tell us why you would find those beneficial to you in your hope of reaching conclusions about a case?
Yes. Well, let me say that I examined records from many different mental health professionals. I think we're referring to the same thing. What I referred to is I also reviewed the depositions of many of the doctors and professionals who evaluated Ms. Schenecker after this event. And those are important to me because although I wouldn't adopt the opinions of those other doctors, and I would make every effort to ensure that my opinion was independent, every time a professional sees a patient in the mental health field, there's an opportunity to gather additional specific information. And some of those professionals would report that information in their reports or depositions. So that's also a valuable source of information.
You mentioned also that you consider personal communications. What kind of assistance would they be to you in your evaluation of Ms. Schenecker?
In this case, there were some emails, and there were also some very poignant and tragic handwritten notes that she made in a spiral notebook that I would label personal communications. And they are the thoughts and ideas of Ms. Schenecker to the extent that she could describe them about some of these events.
Dr. Mayer, the last thing that you indicated was that you also do consult or look at depositions. How do they assist you?
Well, as I indicated, and I would add to that the depositions of other experts present additional information, and they also present a point of view that I would certainly consider. In all probability, it's a point of view that I've already considered, but any expert who's evaluating a difficult situation, in my judgment, ought to be able to consider other properly qualified experts' points of view, and they ought to be able to understand where they differ, where they're the same, where the contradictions are. So when I evaluate a case, if those kinds of things are available, I look at that and I think about it, take it into consideration.
Dr. Mayer, in this specific evaluation, what did you learn from the more remote medical and mental health records that pertain to Ms. Schenecker?
Objection, may we approach the floor? Yes.
You mentioned that you find it to be valuable to examine medical records as well as mental health records pertaining to the person that you're evaluating, in this case, Ms. Schenecker. And I think you went so far as to explain to the jury why you thought those were beneficial. Let me ask you point blank, when you looked at the medical records and the mental health records that pertain to Ms. Schenecker, and here at this moment I'm referring more to the ones that are more remote, sometime maybe even years ago, did you, in the course of reading them and evaluating them, did you rely on them to, in some fashion or another, to help formulate your opinion that you may have brought to the court today with you?
Yes.
Having relied on them, I would ask you to clarify, what did you find of value? What did you learn from those records? And again, I'm trying to focus your attention on the ones that are more remote, the mental health records pertaining to Ms. Schenecker that were more remote. In other words, not at December of 2010 and January of 2011, maybe not even at Florida yet, when the Schenecker family had moved to Florida, but perhaps the mental health and medical records from before that time. Can you tell us what you learned from them?
Yes, and indeed, those records I found very relevant and very important to this case. As I evaluate a case that involves any legal implications, particularly criminal implications, one of the first things on my mind, very basic first things, is does this person have some medical condition that affects their thinking processes, their cognitive processes, their judgment, their emotions, and do they have some specific psychiatric disorder, diagnosis, or psychological impairment? So the first question I'm asking myself is there a medical or psychiatric condition here that affects the way this person functions and thinks and feels? And one of the most solid and reliable ways of determining that is to look in their past and determine have they been treated for mental illness. And sometimes we have people who are very ill who have not been treated. Sometimes we have people who have been treated in the past and are no longer mentally ill. Very often when somebody's severely mentally ill today, they have a history. And sometimes they have a history which is well documented with treatment. In this case, there was very good documentation of treatment. And I'm referring specifically to the Walter Reed hospital records and a specific period of inpatient hospitalization during which the diagnoses of bipolar disorder were made.
Dr. Mayer, let me ask you to take a sidestep just for a second. You're a doctor of psychiatry. Do you have the authorization to prescribe medication to patients?
Yes.
Having that certified legal authority to do that, I take it you have some level of understanding of medication?
I do.
In the course of examining medical records, for example, or mental health records in this particular case, did you take note of any particular trends or any particular information that pertained just to Ms. Schenecker that you have later perhaps incorporated into your opinion or relied upon in order to reach an opinion regarding medication?
Yes, I have. And indeed, those records, the Walter Reed Hospital records, were and are very important in that respect. One of the unique aspects of this case is this is a patient, a woman who has been on an incredibly diverse and powerful, what we sometimes call cocktail of medications. And that started back during or before that hospitalization, and it was characterized by treatment with a variety of different powerful medications, which are documented in the record from 2000, certainly as far back as 2007. And they are important today because there's a continuous theme of the utilization of very powerful medications with very difficult to control and problematic side effects, and in spite of that, continuing moderate to severe symptoms of mental illness. So what it established for me is that she had this diagnosis. She was treated with very powerful medications of a diverse range during an inpatient hospitalization, and even with that, this was not an illness which was, certainly not an illness which was curable, and much of the time they couldn't even control her symptoms.
Dr. Mayer, I'm not a doctor, so let me ask you, you may find it a simple question. We hear, you make mention of very powerful drugs. Would these be antipsychotic drugs?
Yes, to be more specific, she was on antipsychotic drugs, antidepressant drugs, anti-anxiety drugs, and what we call mood-stabilizing drugs. And each of those separate categories, she was on multiple medications within that category at one time or another. She was at times on as many as 8 to 10 medications. Other times she was only on 4 or 5.
So these are pieces of information that you were able to learn from examination of the mental health and medical records that pertain to Ms. Schenecker that are what we would have defined as remote, sometime well before the time of this incident?
Yes.
We hear the term antipsychotic, and I guess my question to you is, what is psychosis? Okay, so psychosis is a disorder of the brain, of the mind, if you will, in the sense that we think of the brain as the physical substance and the mind as something that's more a part of our humanity. It's a disorder of the brain and the mind. To make it simple, and not to talk down to anybody, but to make it simple, where a person has ideas or experiences which don't connect with common sense reality. They are in some meaningful and substantial way out of touch with reality. And in this sense, I'm not talking about the person who just knows they're going to win the lottery and goes and spends $100 buying lottery tickets. That person may be out of touch with reality too, but this is a different kind of out of touch with reality. So psychosis is a state of mind where a person is out of touch with reality in some meaningful and substantial way. Very often that includes hallucinations. They hear things or see things or feel things that are not really there and they believe them to be true. Or it involves delusions. They have beliefs which are just disconnected again with common sense reality. That there are spaceships that come to their living room and feed them French fries in the middle of the night, or some other bizarre belief. The third aspect of psychosis is what we call a thought disorder, a pattern of illogical thinking that is disconnected with reality. So if, for example, I believed that I could be sitting in this chair speaking and standing in that doorway watching myself at the same time, that would not be logical, common sense reality. And one of the explanations for that would be a psychotic condition.
There are other patterns of illogical thinking besides the one I've just illustrated that are also a part of psychosis. We refer to them professionally in a very general sense as a thought disorder or a psychotic thought disorder. And again, these are not subtle things. These are not things where the person just has some unusual ideas that everybody doesn't agree with. These are more substantial aspects of thinking illogically.
Dr. Mayer, in your examination of the medical records and the mental health records that are remote and not directly connected to the incident at hand that's the subject of this trial pertaining to Ms. Schenecker, did you see evidence or mention in those records of hallucinations or delusions or thought disorders? Any of them?
Yes, there's a very clear documentation of a psychotic episode in, I think it was March 2007, while she was in the hospital. It continued for about, it was documented in the record for about 2 weeks, maybe a little less than 2 weeks. And it involved reference to hallucinations, though they weren't specific what exactly the hallucinations were. And there were references to psychotic symptoms in the record. So what that established for me was that there was very good documentation of a psychotic disorder that occurred in 2007, long before any of this incident was present.
Dr. Mayer, is the psychotic disorder illustrated accurately by bipolar disorder? That's the diagnosis that was reached in the past by other doctors that came along long before you?
That's correct to a point. I would add, though, that we do distinguish in bipolar disorder of different types. And one aspect of how it's described is bipolar disorder with psychotic features. So in some of the records of her treatment, the entry of psychotic bipolar disorder with psychotic features appears. In other records, it simply is noted as bipolar disorder, and it sometimes says last episode unspecified, which means they're not really saying what the most recent problem was, whether it was mania, whether it was psychosis, whether it was depression, but they're saying they're sure of the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So this specific diagnosis of bipolar disorder with psychotic features is noted in the record back in 2007 and periodically after that.
Dr. Mayer, could it be safely concluded by a layperson listening to that phrase, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, that would be considered by you to be a major mental health issue?
Yes.
After a patient, and I guess I could generalize, but even get specific with Ms. Schenecker, after a major mental health disorder, does somebody stay sick every single day to the point that somebody seeing them would recognize it every single day?
What I would say is certainly a layperson, even sometimes a family member, might not recognize it every single day. Most serious mental health disorders are episodic. That is, they come, they remain symptomatic, they impair the person for some period of time, and then particularly in younger years, the person gets better for a while. They may even become asymptomatic. That is, they don't have symptoms of depression, of mania, of psychosis. For the most part, as a psychiatrist, we continue to identify that person as suffering from the illness because we know that it's an episodic illness. We know that it comes and goes. And if they've had a depression episode, if they've had a psychosis episode, and it hasn't been 30 years since they've had one, they're probably going to have another one. If they had one in their 20s and they haven't had another one for 20 years, we might say, okay, they probably don't suffer from this anymore. But in her case, beginning in her military career, actually, when she started suffering from depressions, and continuing up through the present, she has had this episodic pattern of severe symptoms and impairments associated with a mood disorder and specifically bipolar disorder.
Dr. Mayer, you've had an opportunity, as you said earlier in your testimony, to have 11 different interviews or evaluations of Ms. Schenecker. You also, I take it, have evaluated lots of other patients as well. My question to you as a psychiatrist in this area, do people that have the mental illness actually feel sick every day? Have you learned from anecdotal evidence, or have you from the interviews with Ms. Schenecker? Do they feel sick every single day?
Generally, they don't feel sick every single day, and in particular, people with bipolar disorder have this aspect of their disorder that we call mania. At its most intense, at its worst, mania is a very unpleasant, disruptive, painful experience. But as a person is going into it, they may feel energized, creative, interested in their environment, able to go with 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night without feeling sleep deprived. So they can both feel better because of the mania, and they can feel just normal. So an individual with bipolar disorder typically does feel good or normal some of the time. Again, typically as people get older, the negative parts of the illness outweigh the positive parts. So even with the mania, which can sometimes be a positive experience, they may feel sick because they're irritable, they're agitated, they're impatient, they get angry about things that don't make sense. So they don't feel sick every day, but they tend, as time goes on, to feel more chronically ill.
Dr. Mayer, as a treating psychiatrist, in the course of an evaluation, I take it you rely on the records that you look at, like you've told us this afternoon?
Yes?
And I take it you rely on the interviews with the actual patient, correct?
Yes.
Do you, in this case, in your examination of the records, the medical records as well as the mental health records pertaining to Ms. Schenecker, the ones that you have relied upon in the formulation of your opinion, did you see any evidence in those records of Ms. Schenecker in the past over-reporting symptoms?
Well, I'm thinking. Actually, I can't think of a single example of her over-reporting symptoms. There are many examples of her under-reporting symptoms.
Explain to us the difference and how that would be significant in your attempt to come to conclusions about a situation like this.
Yeah. So the way that I would describe that is as a general medical doctor first, and then as a psychiatrist. As a general medical doctor, what I know about medicine and the way people seek treatment is that people often tell a story to their doctors or their health providers, which is not exactly the whole absolute, unvarnished, objective facts of their circumstance. For example, if they have a headache and they think their doctor isn't going to take it real seriously, they may over-report their headache. They may say, it's the worst headache I've ever had, doc, when it maybe isn't really the worst headache they've ever had. So in general medical context, before we talk about psychiatry, people tend to think about how they're communicating with their healthcare providers, their doctors, and they sometimes will over-report something, or they may be afraid that their doc's going to give them medicine that they don't want. So they say, well, I have some pain in my chest, but it's not really that bad. No, a smart doctor is going to follow that up and try to figure out how bad it is. But people over-report and under-report their symptoms all the time. And psychiatry patients are probably worse with that than general medical patients. So they develop a sense of how their doctors are going to respond to them. If they think that if they tell the doctor about these symptoms, he's going to give them this medication, and they don't like the side effects of this medication, they may not tell them about those symptoms. So Ms. Schenecker sometimes would be given antipsychotic medications, medications which are very powerful, very sedating, very unpleasant to take. And she would be given those, particularly when she told her doctors that she was suffering from manic or psychotic symptoms. So sometimes she would underreport that. She would be having those symptoms, and she wouldn't tell the doctors how frequently, how severe, how intense they were.
In a situation like that, does that make it harder for the doctors to treat the patient?
It certainly makes it harder, yes.
And in this case, would it have made it harder for the doctors to understand fully Ms. Schenecker's condition and treat her condition?
Yes.
Dr. Mayer, I want to ask you to refer back now to your review of the records that maybe pertain to the time period before Ms. Schenecker arrived in Florida, before the Scheneckers even moved here. And again, I would ask you this. Are those records, even though, again, they're not specifically related to the incident at hand, do those records that deal with Ms. Schenecker's treatment before she came to Florida, are they still important to you and in some fashion that you would perhaps rely on them in the formation of your opinion?
They're very important, and they're particularly important because they are documented descriptions of not just her health circumstances, but to some extent who she is as a person. And they go back before there's any question of a criminal offense or her harming her children or anything related to that. So they give a snapshot, not by any means a perfect snapshot, but a snapshot of who she was when she was dealing with these mental health professionals back in those times and during those treatment experiences.
As a treating physician, as a treating psychiatrist, do you find these records are helpful in an attempt to understand and to treat a patient?
They're especially helpful in the treatment respect because they, and I have not treated her, but those kinds of records are especially helpful in the treatment respect in that when we treat a person, we are really trying to look at the whole human being. At least that's what we ought to be doing. And I think that's what her doctors tried to do. And in doing that, we need to understand how they feel about things, what they think about them, what's important in their lives. Her role as a mother and as a wife was very important to her, for example. And that's evident in these records of her inpatient treatment. Her interest in communicating the nature of her illness to her husband and her children is one of the specific things mentioned in those records. So understanding what's important to her on a human level, not just what her diagnosis is or how she responds to medications, is another important aspect of understanding those records, understanding how they might be relevant to a present-day evaluation or analysis of her and how they relate to her not just as a case and a diagnosis, but as a whole human being.
Dr. Mayer, with respect to the records that pertain to this time period, before she ever even got to Florida, what else did you learn besides the ideas that you've shared with us already? Did you learn anything else about Ms. Schenecker in this specific case?
It's clear from those records, some of her personal history and background is evident in those records, that she served honorably in the military.
Objection, may we approach?
Dr. Mayer, again, just to be clear, you reviewed all sorts of records pertaining to Ms. Schenecker, and the ones that we're talking about now pertain to the time period from before Ms. Schenecker and her family arrived in the state of Florida. In other words, they're very remote as to the actual incident that we're here to discuss in this trial, correct?
Yes.
My question to you is, again, do you find those beneficial or helpful in order for you to be able to formulate an opinion as to the person, as to what happened in the situation, and as to be able to understand enough to form your opinion?
Yes, I do. And there are specific items in those records that are relevant to that consideration, many of which I've mentioned.
And just to be clear, so that there's no misunderstanding about this, you were not present for Ms. Schenecker, her career as a soldier. You didn't meet her when she was a soldier, correct?
That's correct.
You don't have personal information that's related to her daily work as a soldier or how she performed those jobs or her duties, correct?
That's correct.
When you make reference to what you've learned from the medical records or what you've learned from the mental health records or what you've learned from the military records, you're relying, if I understand you correctly, just on what you were able to read that is the composite history from the entity that provided you the records?
That's correct. And those records include a recitation of specific aspects of her personal history, and that's what I was referring to.
Okay. Did you learn enough in the course of your review of the records, and again, all the records we've been discussing, to reach any kind of a conclusion on your own of a diagnosis that would be appropriate for Ms. Schenecker?
Well, I didn't approach it that way, so I think I'd have to say I don't know. What I would say from a hypothetical point of view is certainly this set of records is sufficient to make a diagnosis. It's not sufficient to say what her condition today is, but it's a very clear professional, without a lot of controversy. I would offer that any similarly qualified professional would say these records are legitimate records of somebody who has bipolar disorder.
With psychotic features?
I would certainly offer that, yes.
Okay. One other question I would have about, and again, just to not to put too fine a point on this, but you're a treating psychiatrist, correct?
That's correct.
What is the difference, for purposes of those of us that may not understand the nuance, what is the difference between a treating psychiatrist and a non-treating psychiatrist?
There are people in my profession who limit their practice to evaluations only, either for a long period of time or at some point in their career. I have always engaged in treatment. About half of my practice today is treatment. It is my belief that evaluation and treatment, good evaluation and treatment, always go hand in hand, because in good evaluation there is some treatment, and in treatment there is always continuing evaluation. So it's my belief that that's an optimal combination. I'm not criticizing doctors who do it differently, simply stating that that's my style of practice and why I believe treatment and evaluation go together.
Dr. Mayer, earlier you indicated with your testimony that mental health conditions such as the one that Ms. Schenecker has and has been diagnosed with is episodic, and I think you described what that meant. Do you find in the course of your work as a treating psychiatrist that patients are more or less inclined to reveal symptoms of their mental illness after the episode has already passed? Because episodes come and go, as you said.
Very often people are willing to, much more willing to reveal the personal and most private aspects of an illness or a problem after it's gone. It's often easier, if you will, for people to talk about the scariest aspects of a psychotic episode when they're not psychotic anymore. In fact, there's an example of that in these remote records we're talking about, where there's an entry by a professional.
Objection, non-responsive at this point.
Can you tell us what that example would be? Can you share with us what that example is, as long as it's part of the record that you reviewed in order to help you understand the situation and maybe form an opinion?
Yes. There's an entry in the record indicating that the patient was more willing to reveal some of her psychotic experiences while watching television, and that record is made as the apparent psychotic episode is diminishing.
Dr. Mayer, I want to move you forward in time. The Scheneckers have moved to the state of Florida, and from their arrival, I'd like to ask you to consider a segment of time from the arrival of the Scheneckers in Florida, to Florida, up until, for example, December of 2010. Again, not at the time of the incident, but somewhat much closer to it. Can you tell me, did you review that time period through the medical records, mental health records, military records? Did you review any of that time period at all?
Yes, I did review that time period, and I utilized primarily medical records.
And with respect to those medical records and your review of them, did you utilize that information in order to formulate your opinion?
Yes.
And you found it beneficial to be able to have that knowledge and that information from those records?
Yes.
What exactly did you learn? To put it in a nutshell to start out with, what did you learn about Ms. Schenecker from that time period from the arrival in Florida up until December of 2010?
Objection, vagueness.
The big picture was that the diagnosis that was previously made was reestablished and reconfirmed. The difficulty in managing her medications and treating her symptoms continued, and the pattern of occasional episodic improvements and relapses, that is, worsening of symptoms, continued over that period of time. So the big picture is that she was still sick, it was still episodic, she still had a lot of trouble in managing medications, and there were fewer periods of apparent good functioning during that period of time. Many
Previous witnesses have talked about the more immediate past of Ms. Schenecker as the time period gets closer to January of 2011. I want to ask you to address specifically through your review of the records, if you can, the fall of 2010. Do you remember reviewing records, medical records, mental health records pertaining to Ms. Schenecker's involvement in that time period?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell us what you learned from them?
She was in a particularly difficult condition during the fall of 2010. She had symptoms of depression. She had symptoms of mania, racing thoughts, insomnia. She had developed a pattern, probably I would say within 2 or 3 years, of drinking more alcohol, what I would describe as self-medicating. And she was drinking probably a bit more alcohol in the fall, so at least beginning in the fall or possibly beginning before that. Her medications were not suppressing her symptoms. She had also developed a pattern of gambling, which was diagnosed as pathological gambling, a frequent side effect of these kinds of disorders. So in many... And she was struggling with very sad and unsatisfactory family relationship issues with her husband as well as with her children. So many things had gotten worse for her leading up to the fall of 2010.
Do you remember from your review of the records what the response was? What did this cause? In other words, the problem's still there. How was it treated? How was it dealt with?
There was a focus of attention on the alcohol use, and there was a focus of attention on her medications. And the doctors attempted to change and utilize different medications. One medication in particular is of a good deal of importance to me, if I may explain.
What is that one, sir?
The Lamotrigine.
Well, first of all, can you tell us what is Lamotrigine used for?
Sure. Lamotrigine, also called Lamictal, is a medication that was originally developed for seizure disorders. And it was discovered that some seizure disorder medications also seem to help people with wildly swinging mood disorders. Some people think there may be some connection between seizure disorders and swinging mood, if you will. So Lamotrigine is a medication which was identified as a medication which is useful to some people with mood disorders to stabilize their mood. She was on probably at least four different mood stabilizers in the course of her treatment, none of which were consistently very effective. But Lamotrigine was one that seemed to be a bit more effective than others. It unfortunately has a rare but occasionally severe and occasionally lethal side effect.
What is that, sir?
It's a pattern of extreme skin reaction, sometimes referred to a rash. It's actually much more than a rash, where a person's skin literally falls off as if they've been burned. And in bad scenarios, and there are a number of reported in the case literature, people go into a burn unit and they die from it. So it is a very, very bad, rare, but very, very bad reaction to this drug. So she was taking the drug and she developed a rash. So that's a red flag that a person might be vulnerable to this potentially lethal side effect. In the leading up to the fall, I think it was actually in the summer, but when she got worse and they couldn't control her symptoms, they talked to her about going back on the Lamotrigine. And she knew that it was a drug that could be very harmful to her. But her doctors and her also thought that it might stabilize her mood a bit better. So this, when I read the record, this tells me that there's a level of desperation that the patient and the doctors are facing when they consider a medication which could potentially be lethal to the person. They've been discontinued it because of previous concerns about side effects, and they're thinking about starting it again because they can't control the symptoms without it. So it was in this period of relapse, and I don't remember the exact date. It may not strictly have been the fall of 2010, but it was around that time period that she went back on the Lamictal.
Lamotrigine, Lamictal, was being prescribed to her by Dr. Obregon, who she was seeing at the University of South Florida, according to the records that you read. Is that correct?
Yes.
You talk about drugs that have a side effect. I want to, I guess, bring up the subject of tardive dyskinesia. Am I pronouncing that correctly? I've heard tardive and tardive.
I would say tardive dyskinesia.
Okay. What is tardive dyskinesia?
Okay, so tardive dyskinesia is another very bad side effect of some of these psychoactive drugs that we psychiatrists and other doctors prescribe. And it is a similar situation in some respects to the Lamictal. That is, we don't use these drugs unless we think it is extremely important to use them. They're not.
Let me interrupt you just for 1 second, Dr. Mayer. When you say we don't use these drugs, who are you referring to, and what's your perspective?
Sure. I'm sorry. Treating clinicians engaged in the practice of psychiatry don't use these drugs unless, where there's an indication of a side effect, unless there is a very serious, powerful need to use them, which is a physiologically and biologically treatment-resistant patient who has severe symptoms, which describes this case. So tardive dyskinesia is a body movement disorder where very disturbing involuntary movements of the body occur, and anxiety and restlessness occurs, and it is caused primarily by antipsychotic medications. Abilify, in her case, is a medication which caused this pattern of tardive dyskinesia. And there was a recognition of that indicated in the record, and a recognition that in spite of the side effects, it might still be a reasonable and proper medication to use. So the problem with tardive dyskinesia was similar, tardive dyskinesia and Abilify was similar to the problem with the Lamotrigine.
So Ms. Schenecker, during this time period, was being prescribed at least 2 medications or forms of medication that had severe side effects that were very negative in nature, as you've described.
Yes.
Dr. Mayer, in the course of your review of the records for this time period, and again, I'll be specific to medical records, as well as any mental health records, for this time period in the fall of 2010 or beyond, all the way up through December, did you become aware through a review of those records of any hospitalization of Ms. Schenecker?
Yes, she was hospitalized in a facility which is primarily a substance abuse facility, Winmore.
Winmore. Tell us what you know about that hospitalization, of what you learned from looking at the records. What was the reason for her to be there? How long was she there? What was happening to her there?
It was essentially triggered or precipitated by a motor vehicle accident she had, and concern about, from her doctors and very much from her husband, and to some extent her, about alcohol consumption and the extent of her alcohol consumption. And it was a facility that is utilized primarily to treat alcohol and other substance abuse problems, and not primarily an inpatient psychiatric hospital.
Do you know how long that Ms. Schenecker stayed at Woodmore?
I don't recall the exact number of days. It was a relatively short stay. It was not, for example, a full 28-day stay.
Dr. Mayer, could you, from an examination of the records pertaining to Ms. Schenecker from that time period, right around the time that she was released from Winmore, can you make any assessment, if you will, about what would have been a better course of action or the right course of action for her, given her situation?
What I can say is when she was discharged from Winmore, her psychiatric condition, based on the records provided, and medical and other records that I reviewed, was severe, and she was severely disabled. She essentially spent the next several weeks in bed and was dysfunctional, was completely dysfunctional. So she may not have been drinking as much or any during some of that period of time, but she was psychiatrically disabled. She needed to be in an inpatient psychiatric hospital, in my judgment.
Dr. Mayer, did you see any evidence in your review of the medical records from that time period in the fall of 2010 all the way up to the end of December 2010 that would be consistent with her having any other hospitalizations besides Winmore?
She had a problem with blood clots, but I don't think it was during that period of time. I don't recall another hospitalization.
So, as I understand your testimony, based on your review of the records, Ms. Schenecker still has bipolar disorder with psychotic features. She still has a major mental illness, correct?
Yes.
And she goes, the only hospitalization that she is involved with is at Winmore, which is a facility that deals specifically or primarily with alcohol abuse.
That's correct. She did not get inpatient psychiatric treatment during that period of time.
So she comes out and she still has the same mental illness, correct?
Not only does she have the same mental illness, she has the same mental illness in a period during a very bad episode of that illness.
And that's what you were describing earlier about her behavior in terms of getting out of bed and that type of thing?
Yes.
Are there any other things that you learned about Ms. Schenecker's behavior in that time period after her release from Winmore, based on your review of the records, that you have used in order to form an opinion in this matter as to what happened and correct assessment of the situation?
There were some records related to her interaction with her physicians. There was a canceled appointment. She was not regularly or intensively engaged in treatment. That is, there was a lapse in her treatment after she was discharged from Winmore.
Are you referring to missed appointments or lack of appointments?
I'm referring to missed appointments and not sufficiently frequent appointments.
Okay. Would it be fair to say, from your review of the records, that you've come to the conclusion that she was becoming more psychotic during this time period towards the end of the year at 2010?
Yes.
Would it be fair to say that everything was deteriorating for her in terms of her mental illness at the end of 2010?
I would certainly say her internal mental condition was deteriorating. Her grasp on common sense reality was deteriorating. That is, her thought disorder and those elements of underlying psychosis were getting worse. Her social support system was deteriorating. She didn't have and didn't feel she could reach out to people for support. All of the important things that helped her cope with her illness were deteriorating.
Dr. Mayer, in terms of your review of the records, as well as now of the police reports, you are aware that Ms. Schenecker eventually, on January the 22nd, went to buy a firearm, correct?
I am.
Did you get a chance to look at the records or reports that detail that purchase?
Yes.
Did you find anything out of the ordinary about her behavior in the process of purchasing the gun? And here I'm talking about visible signs of psychosis that would have been recognizable for the people that were viewing her at that time period.
I didn't see anything that would indicate that she displayed those signs or symptoms in the course of purchasing the firearm.
So the people that were at the gun shop, people that sold her the firearm, they wouldn't have had any particular reason to think she was mentally ill, correct?
Based on what I've seen, that is correct, yes.
Is that unusual, Dr. Mayer, that somebody can go through on a day-to-day basis and look and act just fine when perhaps they're not just fine?
No, it's certainly not unusual. May I explain briefly?
Sure.
So again, common sense, people understand that in our community, in our society, it is not typical or socially desirable to wear your illness on your sleeve, to go around talking about how your high blood pressure is acting up or other things. Some people do. Most people keep their illness symptoms to themselves. Unfortunately, even more so when the illness symptoms are that your brain doesn't work right, that you're suffering from a psychiatric disorder or a psychological disease. People keep those symptoms to themselves. They don't go around talking about them in the workplace for the most part. They don't go around telling the cashier at the grocery store what they're thinking. And they certainly don't tell somebody who they're buying a firearm from their deepest, bad, unpleasant, confused thoughts. So it is very typical that people, whether they're mentally ill or physically ill or not, typically don't display their symptoms of illness. And Ms. Schenecker is certainly typical in that respect. That is related to her military background, other aspects of her personality and structure. She didn't want to display that. It was a shame and embarrassment to her.
So if I understand your testimony correctly, your review of the records that have been provided to you would disclose a person with serious brain illness that was in some fashion or other not always recognizable for that by people in the community.
Objection, leading. The form of the question is sustained.
Would people in the community have an opportunity to see the serious brain illness that this woman had when she was walking amongst them or talking amongst them or interacting with them?
Generally, no. Possibly rarely, but generally, no. People would not have had an opportunity to observe that directly or to infer it indirectly.
Did Ms. Schenecker have a serious mental illness well before she ever went to purchase a firearm?
Yes.
And your sources for this, sir?
At this point, as in our discussion, my sources are records That is, I have also talked to her about that, but in terms of our discussion and my answering your question now, I'm basing that on the records.
You discussed earlier in your testimony, Dr. Mayer, psychosis and what it meant. There's been much testimony in this trial about the purchase of the firearm by Ms. Schenecker. In your opinion, based on your evaluations, your interviews with our client, as well as your review of the records, was the mere act of buying a firearm, making that purchase on January 22nd, picking it up on January 27th, was that the mere act of purchasing a firearm psychotic?
No, frankly, it doesn't say much of anything about whether a person is psychotic or not psychotic, depressed or not depressed, terrified of their neighbor or not terrified of their neighbor. Buying a firearm simply isn't a behavior that tells us a lot about what's going on in somebody's mind, except that they want a firearm.
In the course of your interviews with Ms. Schenecker, did she ever say to you that she wished to kill herself?
Yes.
In the course of your review of the records that you've examined, both medical records, mental health records, did you see any references to her having told other doctors in the past that she wanted to kill herself?
Yes, there are multiple references to her chronic struggle with suicidal feelings.
Did you have any conversation with her regarding specifically the onset of these feelings? In other words, when they originated?
Yes, I did have conversations with her about that.
Can you tell us about that?
Yes, she told me that she first began to feel experience depression clearly in her military years. There were some periods of unhappiness and maybe disturbed thinking in her teenage years. I couldn't distinguish that from normal teenage unhappiness. But there were periods during her military career when she would anticipate, that is, she could sort of see a depression coming. She would get a leave or a leave of absence from her duties. She would go to a distant city, check into a hotel, and remain there in bed for days or a couple of weeks, as long as she could, and think about suicide. And then she'd get better, and she'd go back to work. So she struggled with depression at least from her military years, during a time when she first began having episodes of serious depression.
Dr. Mayer, in terms of trying to loop back around to my earlier questions regarding the purchase of a firearm, did Ms. Schenecker tell you any specific reason why she wanted to go purchase a firearm?
I talked to her about that a number of times, and there were times she gave me specific information. There were other times she sort of was ambiguous about that specific information. So unfortunately, I can't give a clear, definite response to your question. What I can say that is definite is it was clear that she expressed to me that she was thinking and planning to kill herself as she anticipated getting that firearm. And it is my belief she also expressed to me pretty clearly that prior to buying the firearm, it had crossed her mind that if she killed herself, she would also have to kill her children. My understanding of what she expressed to me is that she was much more clear that she was going to kill herself and not so clear about the children.
Why is that?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand. But when you say why?
When she indicated that she had a very clear idea that she wanted to kill herself, and then you made mention of the fact in your opinion that that would mean that she might be considering taking the children with her, why do you get to that point?
Okay, so when I talked to her about it on different occasions, she would always come back to the issue of, I couldn't take it anymore, my life was over, I didn't see any way out, I was going to kill myself. And then she would sometimes include in that some discussion about how much she loved her kids and how wonderful her kids were. And she would then also include in some of that discussion with me references to, I don't see how I can leave them here alone. I don't see, I have to take them with me. She would make those kinds of statements. So she made reasonably consistent statements about killing herself and very inconsistent statements about killing the children.
Dr. Mayer, I want to draw your review of the records now to the immediate period of time that we've just touched upon, this period of time from January 22nd to January 27th, the purchase of the firearm and the eventual use of the firearm to shoot the children. What have you learned from your examination of the records as well as other documents that you've told us about that?
My conclusion is that she did indeed shoot both of her children, and that she, at the time that she did that, she knew that she was shooting them. She had an awareness of the fact that she had a gun and that pointing the gun at their heads and pulling the trigger would kill them.
Are you able to reach an ultimate opinion in this case based on all the information that you've considered, all the documents that you've read and reviewed, as well as the evaluation interviews you've had with our client, Ms. Schenecker?
Yes.
And what is that opinion, sir?
You're referring to the insanity issue, is
Yes.
that correct? My conclusion is that she, as I've just described, she knew what she was doing in that concrete sense as I've just described it. She did not know that it was wrong. She believed that she was protecting her children from something truly and terrifyingly horrible in doing it. She believed that she was going to stay with her children, bring them with her to heaven as a result of this, and that it was a part of her necessary duty as a mother to do this. So it is my conclusion that she was not aware of the wrongfulness of it, and she was not aware of what she was doing in any sense of the humanity of it, the horror of it, the absolute lack of necessity. None of this had to happen, and she had no awareness, no capacity to be aware of how senseless any of this was.
Dr. Mayer, you mentioned a moment ago that she was trying to protect her children from something. Did you get any kind of an idea from your interviews with Ms. Schenecker as to what she was trying to protect them from?
I did.
Can you share that with us?
Yes, it's difficult. I talked to her about this a number of times, and she's talked to other people about this, and I've reviewed some of that information. The pain that she was suffering from is something she wanted to protect her children from. The horrible life that she experienced was something she wanted to protect her children from. At times, she made statements that I consider references to fears that her children would be hurt in a terrible and dangerous world. She had a history herself of sexual abuse and made references to me of concerns about her daughter. She also had concerns about passing on her DNA and her bipolar disorder to her children. She had concerns that her children were changing in some way that was more than and different from normal teenagers acting up and being mouthy. She had fears and concerns that there was some fundamental change, that they were 180 degrees different than they had been before. All of these things, I think, were some of the broad, general, but very powerful and overwhelming concerns she had. She did not state to me, nor if I understand that she stated to other people, some specific concern about some very particular delusional or other aspect, like a fire-breathing dragon outside the window that she had to protect her children from. She had broader, more ambiguous, but still terrifying concerns.
So as January 27th, 2011 came, would it be your opinion, sir, that Ms. Schenecker suffered from a major mental illness at the time of this incident?
Yes.
Would it be your opinion that, in fact, she was unable to know that what she was doing was wrong?
Yes.
So she was legally insane at the time of this incident, in your opinion?
That is my conclusion, yes.
Judge, could I have a moment? Judge, I'll pass the witness.
Why don't we at this point give the jury about 15 minutes comfort break? You're reminded of my prior admonition. They'll send them out.
All rise.